strolled through St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey and basked in the glorious marble and granite homoeroticism of the monuments and wondered how they decided who would be immortalized and why they all have six packs? And above all, who authorized all of this? And who paid for it? Well, tonight, I and Zach White have convened a meeting with Gemma Shearwood, a PhD candidate at York University and an expert on the confluence of art history and imperial commemoration in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral. She is here with us to break down the superbly named Committee of Taste, Parliament's answer to all of the questions we just asked. Gemma, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me and for such a loquacious introduction. Goodness me.
Well,
Can
we
I
do our
just
best.
say this because every guest gets to hear this? Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Because the idiot in the room who's opened this forgot to actually welcome the listeners and the guests to the actual podcast. But
It was
well played,
implied.
Luke. It was implied. It was implied. We're training him up. He'll get there in time.
Listen, man, my expertise on scripts is 19th century scripts. You want 21st century scripts, go to one of the various brilliant young men we've hired, all of whom appear to be under the age of 20 and designed specifically to make you and I feel very old. All right, well, hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Do you want me to go again from the beginning, or are we
No,
good?
it's fine. We'll just leave this in the edit because by this point
Excellent.
people are used to us faffing around.
They
But yeah,
are indeed.
let's actually get on with this. Hi Gemma, great to see you.
Thank you.
The fundamentals here, that's where I really want to start. The Committee of Taste. What? Because it sounds like something that you might sort of see on MasterChef or something. So this Committee of Taste, what was it? And how does it come about in the first place?
So it has its informal name is the Committee of Taste, really. Its official title is the Treasury Committee for the Erection of National Monuments. But it kind of gets this idea of being called the Committee of Taste because one of the early chairmen says that the idea is that it's going to be a testimony to the taste of an age in which the works were executed. So the whole thing is it's trying to sort of shape national taste, really. So that's where it gets its brilliant name from. Kind of set it in the long context because I feel like as you've said, if you go into Westminster Abbey, if you go into St. Paul's, you'll see a whole bunch of six packs and sort of really enthusiastic national commemorations. And they kind of, when you see them from the 21st century, you assume that this is an idea that was fairly organic and that happened without much effort. However, if we set it in its long context, in the 18th century, so before the Napoleonic Wars, most monuments are privately funded. So most of the monuments that you see in Westminster Abbey are privately funded. St. Paul's doesn't have any. Famously, I don't know if you've heard about this, it burned down. Might be familiar with that. So in the 1666, the Great Fire of London, St. Paul's burns down, gets rebuilt by Christopher Wren, 1675 to 1710. And no monuments are in there, no monuments survive. Westminster Abbey at this point is just acquiring more and more and more monuments, privately funded ones. And there's 5 that are then state funded. So the first one we get is in 1708. That's a monument that's funded by Queen Anne to Sir Cloudesley Shovel. Then we have to wait 50 years for another one. So the first one, as we would call it, a nationally funded parliamentary memorial, is Robert Taylor's Captain James Cornwall Monument. That is commissioned in 1747 and it's finished in 1755. They really like that one. So they do another one. They do James Wolfe famously dies on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec. They commissioned that monument in 1759. Now, one of the main issues with statues is they take a really long time to do. This one doesn't finish until 1772. It takes him 12 years. Then after that, we get a sort of succession of a couple more. We get William Pitt, the first Earl of Chatham, the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary. And we get the we call it the Three Captains Monument. So it's William Bain, William Blair, and Robert Manners, who die in the Battle of Isons in 1782. So through an entire century, you've got 5 national monuments, really, at a really slow pace. But then what happens is Westminster Abbey gets kind of full. And so all eyes turn to this lovely new cathedral down the road that's got acres of space. And so people start approaching St. Paul's Cathedral and saying, hey, can we stick some statues in here? And it begins with they get 4 on the cathedral floor to start with. Now, these are not publicly funded, and they are not military men. So the first 4 that you get are John Howard, who's a prison reformer, Samuel Johnson, the lexicographer, William Jones, who's the judge of the Supreme Court in Calcutta, and Joshua Reynolds, who's the first president of the Royal Academy. Now, the Samuel Johnson monument is kind of where this idea for the Committee of Taste starts. So that monument is sponsored by the Royal Academy, and the president of the Royal Academy, Reynolds, he suggests that maybe it would be a really good idea to set up a committee so that what happens at St. Paul's Cathedral is not what happens at Westminster Abbey. There's this idea that because they've let any Tom, Dick, and Harry pay for a monument to their cousin's uncle's sister's brother, that it's out of control, it's really chaotic and ugly and full. So Reynolds suggests, right, if we have royal academicians on the committee deciding what St. Paul's monument should look like, wouldn't that be a great idea? He dies really unhelpfully. But he's replaced by Benjamin West, who is the next president of the Royal Academy. And Benjamin West kind of says that monuments should transmit the gratitude of the nation to our departed heroes. Doesn't say what type of heroes they're going to be, given that he paints the death of General Wolfe and the death of Nelson some years later. There's kind of a military undertone that's beginning to take shape. So the Committee of Taste kind of formally bands together at 1793. And it's formed initially by a Tory MP called Charles Long, who kind of comes up with this idea to start with. He just so happens to have gone to university with William Pitt the Younger. I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. And he comes up with this idea that he's going to be the chairman. He's kind of interested in classical sculpture. So he's got this vision that it's going to be a very sort of classical inspired type of aesthetic. He's joined by Viscount Castlebury, who says that the monument should serve as an effective incitement to those who survived to merit the great same distinction by imitating the example bequeathed to them. So already we're getting a real sort of military undertone. These are going to be monuments to war heroes that are going to inspire the next generation of soldiers, sailors, things like that. Also involved is George Beaumont, who then later goes on to found the National Gallery, another antiquary called Charles Townley, and Richard Payne Knight, who is an artist at the Royal Academy. There's also a gentleman called John Banks, who is chair of another committee that purchases the Parthenon marbles in 1812. So again, this is all kind of tied up with this classical antiquity rhetoric. And another couple of friends of William Pitt. It's kind of a cross-parliamentary committee at this stage. They're not all Tories. But then what happens is the Committee of Taste gets going, and they then invite a whole bunch of other Tories to come join them. So you've got Buckingham, Carlisle, supposedly the richest man in Britain, the Earl of Stafford. And you also have another couple of Royal Academicians. So you get Thomas Hope, who's an interior designer, and Uvedale Price, who's another landscape painter. So I kind of like to think of this trio of Stafford, Hope, and Price as like Jeff Bezos, Lawrence Wellermoen, and Alan Titchmarsh, kind of all on the Committee of Taste together, which is fun. And the way that it works is that the politicians, so Parliament, decide who's going to get commemorated. They pitch this idea to the Committee of Taste, who go, yeah, it's a good idea. And then the Royal Academy choose the designs. So there's kind of this balance that works where you've got one side making the kind of political decisions and the other side making the aesthetic decisions, kind of like a bit of a bicycle. The families of the people who are chosen have very little say. So the best example that I've got is there's a monument to Edward Cook that goes into Westminster Abbey. And this is kind of the only example that I have of a family actually having any influence. And they managed to convince the East India Company to pay for a monument to Edward Cook, who dies in the Bay of Bengal. It's his mother who pesters the East India Company into commissioning this monument. And you have the minutes of the company who say they've received this letter. They don't want the pension that we've offered them. They don't want this nice sword that we've offered them. They want a monument, and they're really not happy about it. But that's the only example, and it's also not of the Committee of Taste. It's of this other sort of major institution that's also commissioning monuments at the time. In terms of the people who get chosen, there's Holger Hook ranks these in 3 categories. So number 1, you have long-serving, famous senior people. These are kind of the big daddies, like Viscount Ho, like Nelson, the real big hitters who you'd expect to see. Underneath those, you've got the highest ranking deaths in major battles. So this is where you get your Pictons. And these are the people who, it's a main battle. They were the highest ranking officer. By default, they're going to get one. And then you have my favorite category, which is the young upstart idiots who do something chaotic and outlandish in pursuit of glory and heroism and die horribly. But there's such a story and a narrative attached to it that kind of Parliament's hand is forced because it captures this public imagination. So the committee exists for between 1793 and 1823, and during that time it commissions 37 monuments. So bearing in mind where we started with 5 monuments in the course of a century, this is a huge undertaking in just a 40-year period. In total, how much do you think they might have spent?
Oh, we have an interactive guest on this show. This is unusual. we don't do the answering the questions. We just kind of dream up some dumbass questions beforehand and then fire them at you. How much was spent? Are we talking modern money or historic money?
Either. I've got both.
Oh, preparation. The challenge is we both need to be aware of what the going rate is for a monument during this period. Like, I can do it in terms of modern stuff. Like, if you want a new gravestone, I can help you out with that. But that's just a very unique aspect of my personality. I am going to say the equivalent of £30 million.
You're not far wrong. I mean, you're twice as high, but it's fine. So I thought you were going to say like 3 million, and then I'd be like, oh yeah, they're going to be so shocked by this. No, they spent 12 million, which
total bargain, right?
I thought sounded like a lot of money until you put it in the context of 30. Okay, so in kind of period terms, they spent £117,000, which equates to about 12 million in today's money.
I mean, given what the prince spent rebuilding his palaces, that's a bargain.
It is a bargain. And I think the fact that it's such a bargain kind of attests to the motives behind it in a way. So the sculptors aren't actually seeing this as a cash grab exercise. They are seeing it, I know, outrageous. They're seeing it kind of, particularly one of the sculptors I'll come back to in a minute, he genuinely says, like, I'm doing this for the glory of the nation. So on average, each monument costs about 3,000 to 5,000 guineas, which the going rate for some monuments can cost sort of up to several £1,000s. So actually, in terms of guineas, that's much. They are expensive, but also most of that is the cost of materials because the monuments are made from a lot of marble. They are big.
So you're talking about Parliament, you're talking about the Royal Academy, you're talking about artists, you're talking about a lot of egos and a lot of pettiness. So I have 2 questions here, really. Number 1 is, does St. Paul's actually have a say in any of this? And number 2, talk us through the egos and the pettiness and the personalities, because I can imagine at least at some point someone gets a chisel hucked at their head.
So in terms of does St. Paul's get a say? Ish. So originally when I mentioned the first four, so John Howard, they first start discussing a monument to him while John Howard's still alive in 1786. And the dean and chapter of St. Paul's are not particularly thrilled at the idea. They would really rather they didn't have a monument on the cathedral floor. And this debate kind of goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And when they get the first four monuments on the cathedral floor, there's still some tension that, well, these ones are permissible because they're underneath the crossing, which is the center of the cathedral, underneath the dome. They kind of make sense. There's one at each pillar. That's fine. We're done now, thanks. And then they kind of get coerced a little bit. And also, I think if we're talking about rivalries, I genuinely think that the biggest rivalry you have in this period is between St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey, or at least in terms of the Committee of Taste. So I think to some extent, even today, cathedrals struggle to fund themselves. That's why you have to pay an entrance charge. So that is not new. That was also taking place in this period. So you have down the road from St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, new monuments every week, it feels like. People are going there, they're spending their entrance fee to get a tour, to get taken around the monuments. These are tourist attractions even in the 18th century. St. Paul's wants some of that sweet, sweet, tourist money, please. So I think that to a certain extent, there is some sort of financial motivation that is taking place that's, whether or not it's overt, to be cynical, that can't really be taken out of the equation. And I think that is kind of one of the rivalries that does potentially drive St. Paul's letting more and more monuments onto the cathedral floor, because it's the sense that if we say no, they are going to go back down the road. And indeed, they do start down the road, because that's historically, monuments have always gone in Westminster Abbey. So the first two monuments that get commissioned go into Westminster Abbey until they then make that transition to St. Paul's. My favourite thing is that on the reverse of that, you have Westminster Abbey who are there like, go, guys, don't all the monuments normally come in here? Where are they going? And so this comes to a head with the commemoration of Lord Nelson. So Nelson has his grand state funeral, gets sort of down the Thames. He's in St. Paul's Cathedral. He's buried. They have a really sort of long ceremony. They have the Nelson Monument that's sculpted by John Flaxman that also goes into St. Paul's Cathedral. And at this point, Westminster Abbey are getting a little bit concerned, because everyone's going to want to go and see Nelson. Everyone's going to want to go to St. Paul's Cathedral. If you've got 2 shillings to spend, are you going to spend it in Westminster Abbey where we haven't got any big hitters, or are you going to go and see Nelson? So what they do is, as I said before, with the Wolf Monument, these things take a long time to sculpt. So John Flaxman, the sculptor, he's chipping away at this block of marble for a long time, for a good 8 years. They commission a wax effigy of Nelson. They buy some of Nelson's clothes at the auction. So it's Nelson, looks like Nelson, dressed in Nelson's clothes. They put him in their kind of collection of effigies. They've got a couple, they've got some of the kings, they've got famous people. It's like a pseudo early Madame Tussauds. And on the case, emblazoned across the top, and this is so audacious, is Victory or Westminster Abbey, which reputedly is what Nelson says as he swings to the taking of the San Jose, which is just beautiful levels of pettiness. I think that's my favorite.
What makes that even more impressive to me is that I have it from a friend of mine who tour guides in London, that Nelson gave a great deal of thought between Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, and by the end of his life had plumped for St. Paul's as his final resting place, on the basis that they thought there were some structural issues with the ground upon which the abbey is built on. And so therefore, in 400 years from when Nelson was knocking around, the abbey might not be there anymore. So he basically thought, no, 400 years, nowhere near good enough in terms of longevity. I need at least a full millennium. So you can stick the Abbey. I'm going to St. Paul's, or at least that's how it's been put to me. I've never actually verified it, but
The other side of that, of course, is that um, in Westminster Abbey, he's going to be one of many, whereas in St. Paul's, he's a shining star. Like the Abbey at this point, from what you're describing, has to be getting crowded.
So the reason that Nelson ends up in St. Paul's in the first place is that Lord Hawkesbury, who's in charge of organising the funeral, he writes a letter to the king and he says, as Westminster Abbey is at this time so very crowded with monuments, Your Majesty will perhaps consider that St. Paul's Cathedral is the fittest place for this melancholy ceremony, as well as for the erection of all future monuments, as it may be deemed fit to raise to the memory of those who've rendered considerable naval and military service to this country. So yeah, it's definitely crowded, definitely full. Interestingly, they keep managing to find space. Whenever someone approaches with a new monument and enough money, they manage to find somewhere to put them. But yeah, in terms of Nelson is the shining star at St. Paul's Cathedral because he's sort of interment really is the impetus between this transition between the two.
okay, so let's start talking about the statues themselves, and sort of talking in a sort of quasi case study approach here, rather than just going, who are the people and like what can you see when you walk into St. Paul's? Because like it you need a whole tour, people. Like you need video stuff and all kinds of things. And before anybody gets smart in the comments, yes, we are having thoughts on that. Hold that thought. We may come back to it in due course. But just give us a handful of them. And let's dig into the depictions that you've got going on here, because this is what really hit me in the face when I saw you speak about some of this, was that I'd never really thought about the layer upon layer of imagery and subliminal messaging that's going in behind the fact, look, there's Nelson, or look, there's Abercrombie. I mean, some of it's very obvious, like you've got Sphinx motifs, for example, with Abercrombie, very obviously kind of other motifs that are relevant for other folks. But talk us through these layers and the reasoning behind some of these layers, and also like really fundamental things, materials, I suppose, as well. Everybody would assume that, oh, well, they're all marble. But if I know anything about, the discussions that go on around these things, and particularly around art, like there's a lot of thinking that goes in behind everything. Nothing is accidental. So just blow our minds essentially with how complex this all is.
I think there is a perception that these are very, very complex objects, and they really are. But actually, there is a certain degree of a formula that goes into kind of each monument. And once you sort of understand who you're ticking off when and where, it becomes a little bit less difficult to break down. So fundamentally, you are always going to have some sort of depiction of the deceased. So whether that's a full-size statue, a portrait bust, so just the head and shoulders, you'll also get a lot of medallion portraits, so like ovals with a relief carving of a portrait of the person, usually cut off at the neck, or even in a lot of them, just a sarcophagus. So the implication is the body's inside there. So you're kind of getting a bit of a one remove in terms of depictions of the deceased. You also have some permutation of lots of the same type of allegories. So you usually have a fame, which is a winged female figure, usually carrying a trumpet. You usually have a victory, who, again, a winged female figure, usually carrying a palm frond or a laurel wreath to crown the deceased in glory. Often you'll get Britannia wearing an Athenian helmet, so sometimes she's conflated with Minerva. Usually carries a shield and a trident, usually accompanied by a lion. Now, this formula that's become sort of default for Britannia as we know today, that first appears in 1755 on the Cornwall Monument at Westminster Abbey. So it's really recent for the Committee of Taste context. 75% of the monuments that are commissioned by the Committee of Taste are naval monuments. So you'll usually get a river god or Neptune, which is just an old geezer laid next to an urn that's sort of spilling water. Or you'll get Hercules, who's a really muscular dude with a club and a lion skin. And these are usually the big ones that you'll see. There are various permutations that are very different and very abstract. And the monument does help you along by including certain attributes. So the sculptors sometimes would release we call them puff pieces, just a bit of a press release that really bigs up this monument. And just in case anyone's confused, this is every single allegory I put in there and why. So they're really helpful. And that's also how a lot of people engage with these monuments. Not everyone's going to see them. They're a long way away and you've got to pay to get in. So a lot of people will just read these puff pieces and be like, oh, that's nice. It's a new monument to Nelson. Or alternatively, you can sometimes guess. So I think one of my big aha moments that I had was the Picton monument. Now, the allegory on this is genius. And this is an interactive thing, so I'm going to ask you another question. How do you depict genius?
Interesting, because it's not just like, because we're all scholars, our minds will automatically go to book learning. But in this case, that's not what it's going to be.
No. What if I reframe it? If you've got an idea, what's the little cartoon symbol that normally happens when you've got an idea?
A light bulb.
But in the 18th century, they don't have light bulbs.
That's exactly what I was about to say. So what do you go for? A can? Oh, is it a halo?
No, it's a little candle. You're on the right track.
Okay.
Literally, it has a little candle on his head.
See, this is the trouble that you can't see the Picton Memorial for reasons relating to the fact that Picton was, by everybody's admission, including his ancestors, an arse of a human being. So I was trying to kind of wrap my brains of what I can kind of see around the edge of the wooden frame that they've put. But inevitably, the frame does quite a good job, so you can't really see it. But from what I remember, the Picton one is quite small. Is that right?
It's quite large. So, I mean, there are pictures of it on Google from before the frame went up. So there's 3 allegories. There's Britannia with a lion, there's Fame with a trumpet, and there's Genius with a candle on his head. And they're all kind of crowding around a bust of Picton. So they are quite large, these monuments. I think they only start going into smaller ones when it's somebody who isn't as well known. So Picton's well known enough that he's, regardless of his moral shortcomings, his rank sort of earns him a large monument.
But what I find so interesting about Picton, and we're not going to turn this into a podcast about Picton, but nobody who knows Picton's personal history or his service would associate genius with him. There's nothing in his career that speaks to genius. So it's very odd that they decide to go with that angle as opposed to, I don't know, dedication or service or something that you could draw on as a trait of the guy. Like, hey, look, here's the inverted commas hero who took a musket ball at Quatre Bras, but then stayed with the army and then died at Waterloo. You would expect, for those of us knowing the history, that would be the angle that they take. And yet instead they're going down this genius line, when if he was that much of a genius, he would have realized that it was deeply problematic to be torturing it was a mulatto girl that he tortured in order to try and gain information. Like, if you're a genius, you would kind of work out that that's not a good look and it's probably not the way to run a colony. Just putting that one out there. But I mean, it kind of does point to the fact that these allegories don't necessarily have any grounding in reality. These are just a Rolodex of good traits that some people might have that we can just put on a statue to anybody. It doesn't really always apply. But let's talk about some of the others, because some of them are quite obvious. Abercrombie, Egypt, Sphinxes. Like, I understand that one. Even an idiot like me who has no grounding in art history and like really doesn't see analogies in anything, can kind of like, I can look at that and go, oh yeah, that's what they're doing. Then there's also the one to Moore where he's being lowered. If I've got this right, he's being lowered into a tomb. And so again, you kind of look at that and go, oh yeah, well, I've read the Death of Moore poem by Charles Wolfe, and I can kind of make all of these connections. And so there's an instant question there actually about to what extent does one influence the other. Moore dies in 1809, very famously. There is no body, which kind of speaks to what you're saying earlier about, some of these are actually about, hey, guys, we don't have a grave. We can't bury these guys like we do with Nelson. So, we're going to go with this instead. But with that poem, I'm very curious about what influences what in terms of the imagery, because they are fundamentally producing the same image, just through different mediums. So talk us through some of these, and what else is going on around sort of the big, iconic, obvious stuff that even an imbecile like me can work out.
I think, yeah, so there's the kind of allegorical ones that evoke some sort of classicizing elite snobbery. And then, like you say, there are the ones like the Abercrombie and the Moore that appeal to a very different instinct. So the whole point of these is they're supposed to incite some sort of emotional response. Doesn't matter what that is, it's just you're supposed to be moved somehow. So Benjamin West, when he is president of the Royal Academy, says that these monuments should excite awe and veneration. No boy would be animated by a representation of Nelson dying like an ordinary man. His feelings must be roused and his mind inflamed by a scene which is great and extraordinary. A mere matter of fact will not produce this effect. So with the Abercrombie and the Moore, these are really sort of the emotions of somebody dying in battle set up to about 11. They are intended to really rouse a sense of, for the Abercrombie, it's the tragedy of dying on the cusp of glory. And this is a trope that you see again and again and again. It sort of evokes the biblical idea of Moses on the cusp of the promised land. It is, oh, Britain was just about to win and he's just falling off his horse into the arms of an attendant soldier. That is the tragedy, is that he doesn't live to see his victory. With the Moore, you get something very different. And it's kind of the only example that I can think of that immediately springs to mind of this, where the tragedy is the death itself. And that sparks something very different in terms of what these monuments are doing. Because it's quite easy in 2025. I don't personally know anyone who died in the Napoleonic Wars. There's a real historical remove here. And particularly in this 2025 context, when monuments are quite contentious, we are looking at them as political objects. Whereas I think what the Moore does very effectively is cuts through all of that. And it reminds you that there is a real sense of grief accompanying a lot of these monuments. A lot of the people who died were arseholes, but also a lot of the people who died were victims of Britain's imperial agenda. And these monuments reflect not just the individuals themselves, they also to grieving families who've lost loved ones or family members. It's not necessarily Moore that they're seeing being lowered into the tomb, it's someone that they've lost that they're superimposing onto that image of Moore. And I think that's how the monument and the poem work really effectively. And I think that's why they're still really powerful. And they're some of the ones that we still remember and talk about, because fundamentally they speak to an empathy that we all have. It doesn't really matter. It transcends periods.
Okay, so we have monuments here that are in one designed to evoke in families the images of their own lost family members, and simultaneously designed to arouse certain emotions in the young men of Britain. There's an obvious question here, and it's not the dirty one that your listeners are thinking of. I know you. Sit down. It's this. Where does all of this fit and sit in terms of empire building? Because this is Picton aside, a lot of these, and more aside, a lot of these are in imperial battlefields, right? And
Hmm.
almost all of them have imperial service as well as quote unquote continental service.
Hmm.
And there are a few ways of looking at this. In one sense, this is Britain, Parliament, the Committee of Taste, St. Paul's, or the artist trying to force feed ideas of empire into the eye of the wider public to build support. On another, they're already drawing on the roles of these men in building empire. But they also need to tap into ideas and iconography that people already understand and associate. You've touched on this a little bit with the puff piece bit, right? Here's the allegory so you don't miss it. Let me explain it to you in advance. So, where does all of this sit in terms of building support for empire versus reinforcing existing ideas?
I think you're absolutely right. You've kind of hit the nail on the head there in terms of it's simultaneously trying to create an iconography of military imperialism while also responding to some coalescing ideas of British self-perceptions in the context of what empire looks like. Um, what they're fundamentally trying to do is they're trying to imagine what is Britishness, which is a very big question, but who are the people that we want to commemorate? What is the best of British in terms of who represents the country and the empire and the values that we want to espouse? And how do we represent British? Which is a very poorly phrased sort of way of saying it, but it's what does that look like? Who is doing that? So all of the artists are British born sculptors, and that's fundamentally different to a generation previously where you had Flemish sculptors, French sculptors, Italian sculptors who were all working in Britain. And at one point, when it comes to the commemoration of Nelson, um, big name sculptor of the day is Antonio Canova. And someone suggests, oh, shall we get Canova to do it? He's not done one of these for the Committee of Taste. And there is uproar. There's one royal academician called Prince Hoare, and he's like, should we appoint this foreigner to do Nelson? Are you out of your mind? Um, so it's not just British because of who's represented, it's British because of who's representing who is represented. Um, they're drawing a lot deliberately from classical antiquity. So all of these monuments are white marble, and specifically they're white marble from Carrara, which is in northern Italy. And don't know if you're aware, there's a war on. It's surprisingly pricey to mine or quarry marble from northern Italy, put it on a boat, ship it around the continent into Britain, where it's then sculpted. Um, so it's kind of a really big and important project that they're using this marble particularly. It attests not only to how strong their naval prowess is because they're able to waste time on this and they're able to waste resources on shipping giant blocks of marble. But it also indicates how important that particular marble is that they're willing to waste time and energy on it. There's at one point, again, not a committee of taste one, but the Charles James Fox monument, they have their own little private committee because he doesn't get a national monument. William Pitt the Younger does, and Fox votes against it. And Westmacott is the sculptor who is doing this monument, and he says, marble's really scarce and it's really expensive. Are you sure you want me to get some Carrara marble for this? And one of the committee members suggests, oh, we could use this red granite in Cornwall. Really pretty. Let's use that. Nope, absolutely not. It has to be Carrara marble. And that's because when they're recovering all of these statues from Pompeii and Herculaneum gets rediscovered in the mid 18th century, all of the paint has dissolved. So they think these monuments are white, which is why they're kind of alluding to them through this white marble. What they also do is the monuments assume a general consensus in their inscriptions, which is something we haven't touched on yet. So all of them have erected at public expense, erected by the will of the people, by the will of Parliament on behalf of the nation, some sort of language that implies everyone's on board with this. Parliament is representing the nation, and the nation really wants a monument to this person. There's a real sense of getting people involved with these monuments implicitly. I think as well, they also help people come to terms with empire and understand it a little bit more. I kind of imagine it a bit like I've just started watching Game of Thrones. I'm a bit late. But you know, like the opening scene where they have the map and all of the things come up and it's like do 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 do. That's kind of like St. Paul's in this period. Like all of these monuments are going up and it's like a map of the empire that's sort of slowly getting filled in. And they're bringing little bits of empire. So little bits of flora and fauna. So I think it's on Charles James Rossi's monument to Faulkner. There's a fish that you can only find in the Caribbean. No one will have seen that before. There's little plants and bits of iconography that you wouldn't have seen unless you've been on Imperial service that are slowly making their way back to the capital. Problematically, if we also talk about representations of empire, there's also representations of people that the British are encountering for the first time in the empire. So in the Cornwallis monument, there's a Hindu Brahmin. In the Harding monument, there's a representation of a Sri Lankan warrior. And there's also a representation of a First Nations warrior who we know as Tecumseh on Richard Westmacott's Isaac Brock Memorial. So these monuments are representing for the first time animals, plants, and people that the British in London would not have experienced before. So it's really kind of hammering home this idea of this is how the empire looks, as in terms of this is what British look like or think they look like when they're in the empire. And also this is how the empire in which these people are dying looks.
So the one time that white Carrara marble is actually the correct coloring to use.
Yes. Yes.
And I just want to emphasize for people, like, this is somebody's idea of what a Hindu Brahmin might look like, which you would the imagery is so grossly inaccurate that it was only when you basically sat me down and explained to me almost like chisel blow by chisel blow what has been depicted on some of these memorials that I kind of went, oh, is that who that's meant to be? Because you would have no way of knowing, because it is, as you say, this kind of some guy in London's fanciful construction of what a Hindu Brahmin might be, or a Sri Lankan warrior. And so you look at these individuals and sort of go, well, with our modern knowledge, you wouldn't know what's actually being depicted here. So we part of why this research is so interesting, and there are many reasons for why this is interesting, but one of the things that I find so fascinating about this is that this is where people start shaping the history. All of this stuff about you can't go and rewrite history using modern standards. Like, people, when they made the history, they were using the standards of the time to then instill these attitudes that would last for the next 150 years. So actually all we're doing is the same thing that people kind of threw out there originally. I'm really interested in the role that this has in terms of shaping attitudes beyond their immediate time period. I'm also going to lower the tone with the second part of my question, which alludes to, Luke nods approvingly, and he will approve of this because he mentioned the homoeroticism at the start of this. Like, everybody has a six-pack. There's lots of kind of looking very elegant with sort of the hands on these statues are absolutely beautiful most of the time. A, what's going on with the hands? B, what's going on with the six-pack? And C, how does all of this link into ideas of what man should be and should look like in the period after the era of immediacy, if you like, so, beyond the Napoleonic Wars. How does all of this kind of leave us with legacies that we are still unpicking today in terms of how we think about empire and how we think about the history of this period?
Big question. Cool. Just solve all of the culture wars in 2 minutes.
If you could, that would be lovely.
No pressure, Gemma.
No pressure. It's fine. I think it's interesting that you say sort of that you bring it up actually, because one of my favorite sculptors who I haven't had a chance to mention yet is Thomas Banks. Now, Thomas Banks is a testament to kind of the emergence of the celebrity sculpture through the Committee of Taste. He is a member of the Society of Constitutional Information, which is a kind of radical reform group. He gets arrested in the 1790s for being allegedly part of a conspiracy to kill the king. Doesn't get tried because he's kind of such a big celebrity that it would be a scandal that one of the sculptors who's making our national monuments is also potentially a treasonist. But he writes to his friend. He's done a couple of monuments now, and he's doing the last one is to George Blagden Westcott in 1802. He's sculpting it, goes in 1804. And he says to his friend, I'm really actually quite sick of this now. I'm fed up that we're choosing to represent heroes who've been killed in attempting to kill others and who have carried our national glory to the highest level in destroying the greatest numbers of mankind. And it's one of those things where if we're thinking that, oh, they didn't know any better at the time, or to argue that in critiquing these monuments as we do, that we're applying modern standards, well, people like Banks indicate that there's ongoing discourse that undermines the legitimacy of the entire scheme, even at the time. There is also, to kind of add some balance to some of the more racist depictions, or depictions that we would recognize today to be racist, there is also a genuine interest and curiosity and effort by a lot of sculptors to try and depict certain things as accurately as possible. So the William Jones monument, one of the first ones that goes in, at the bottom of that, there is a really intricate representation of a zodiac wheel and all of this really careful Hindu iconography that intersects with a lot of Christian iconography. It's a real meeting of imperial worlds. And Sarah Monks and Sarah Burnage and Greg Sullivan have written a lot on this, and have done it much more justice than I will, trying to remember it in the next few minutes. So there is a real meeting of different approaches where some of them are absolutely bombastic and are quite easy to dissect as bombastic, and other ones are really complex and nuanced and difficult. And I think it's tempting to come down one way or another. I think particularly at the moment, kind of in this woke culture wars, like either it's cancelled or it's woke, and then it's been sort of reinforced with this idea of the lie that there is a gender binary. There's this idea that it's one thing or the other. There's no nuance. There's no spectrum. I think it's important to kind of embrace those spectrum moments. I think as well, the monuments have kind of become self-defeatist, because I think the fact that when we were discussing this and I was going through the allegories and explaining what to an 18th century audience would have been kind of offhand, they'd have been like, oh, it's got a trumpet, it's fame, clearly. They kind of appeal to a certain knowledge and a certain cultural zeitgeist that doesn't really exist anymore, which on the one hand makes it harder to challenge, but on the other hand kind of means that a lot of the rhetoric has been lost. And so the monuments that we're confronted with now as modern viewers are interpreted very differently. I love that you mentioned hands, just because there is one criticism of these monuments at the time, where Benjamin Hayden, who's a Royal Academician, he says Sculptors don't care how their monuments are executed as long as they are in St. Paul's and they have cash in their pockets. They ought to be ashamed of how misshapen their hands are and how twisted their feet. They are a disgrace to the country.
All right. Well, Gemma, you've solved racism in Check's Clock 5 minutes, so well done on that one. The Napoleonic Wars podcast, ever a servant to the public good. Okay, more of a practical question for you, hopefully one with less minefields attached to it. The committee disbands in 1823, as you've mentioned. But I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but famously the empire keeps going. I know. Okay, for
Heard
listeners,
something like that.
For listeners, both Zach and Gemma's head went the exact same way, the exact same angle at the exact same time. That was beautiful. All right, so we've got, say, Wellington, who dies in 1852, who gets a casket in the crypt of St. Paul's, and then eventually a monument that is larger than anything else in there. Who's responsible for the creation of these? Who's responsible for monuments after the committee?
So it kind of defaults back to a little bit like it did in the 18th century beforehand, where individual parliaments might decide to do an individual monument. It's kind of an unspoken given. Wellington's always going to get one. It's always going to be state funded. I think you also get a lot of privately funded monuments as well. So you normally get smaller special interest groups funding them. They also shift in tone, which I think is quite interesting. So you go from the original 4 St. Paul's monuments, which are kind of artistic. You have a judge, a lexicographer, an artist, and a prison reformer. You then get this swathe of imperial military monuments. And then after that, it goes in a direction which, for 19th century enthusiasts, we call it this idea of muscular Christianity. It's this idea of kind of imperialism reinvigorated with a newfound Christian morality. And it does also touch on this idea of why they all look so butch. It is this idea that it's Christianity reinforced with a really strong arm. And so you get sort of the Thomas Farnshaw Middleton, who's a bishop, Henry Lawrence and Reginald Herber. These are all big imperial bishops who start congregations in various colonies. So it takes a new direction. You also get the surviving Napoleonic dead, so like Wellington. And mostly it does just kind of become a bit of a tourist attraction. So if we're talking about great committee names, we've had the Committee of Taste. How about the Society for Obtaining Free Admission to National Monuments and Public Edifices Containing Works of Art?
Catchy.
Better known by the acronym SOFANMACAWEPCA. It's beautiful. So they're founded in 1837, and they argue that we haven't spent 30 million or however much it was that Zach thought, but we spent 12 million on these monuments and nobody can see them. So maybe we should stop putting new ones up and start using the money we would have spent on new ones to maintain these ones and let people access them free of charge. And I think what's really interesting about St. Paul's and about Westminster Abbey is that the legacy is still ongoing. So we're still getting new monuments in both of these places. So, I mean, Stephen Hawkins went in earlier in 2019, I think it was, that he died. So we're still choosing individuals that we want to commemorate in these places. And, you know, England won last night, so I would like to suggest that maybe we put Serena Wiegmann in one of the pantheons when the time comes.
I love that suggestion. I also love the idea that at some point in the 19th century, somebody clearly decided that God was on the side of the person with the best six-pack, which is a whole kind of mentality around gym culture and gym bros that we haven't held on to, it would seem. Go on, Luke.
Isn't that the title of one of the chapters of Napoleon's autobiography?
I thought, based on the Canova sculpture, that it was God was on the side of the person with the best carved buttocks. But that's a whole conversation for another day.
I
Listen,
mean, you're not
that
skipping leg day, are you? If you're a dictator, you're doing ab crunches and you're doing squats. If he's got a good ass, he's got good abs.
A
there
philosophy
speaks
to
the
live
voice of a
by.
generation.
Um, I could attempt to raise the tone, but I'm not going to bother because Gemma, you've done a fantastic job, and we've covered some really important and troubling topics in amongst all of this. Um, but there is always a core point to any piece of artwork, which is that it needs to be eye-catching, and it needs to either it needs to please the eye, not necessarily in a kind of, oh, that looks pretty sense, but in the, oh, I like what that's trying to do sense. So my question is quite simply, what's your favorite? And seeing as you've been interactive on this, we'll go around the room and see what our collective favorites are. But I'm going to put you on the spot first. What is your favorite?
See, I was thinking about this and it does kind of oscillate between several different ones. Um, I think I think I'd have to go with the Abercrombie. For on the one hand, it is incredibly eye-catching. I'm not particularly a big fan of just the two sphinxes bolted on either side. Just to be like, this is Egypt. But the actual sort of central monument with there's a half-naked office. Well, we don't actually know who he is. A half-naked man with his face in the dirt. That leads into this twisting expanse of fabric that kind of reaches a coil and supports a rearing horse. Now, that's essential because horses, the fetlocks of a rearing horse, to balance an entire marble sculpture on two hooves is quite difficult. So that central piece is basically what carries most of the weight, but it's disguised so well. And then you've kind of got Abercrombie swooning into the arms of a Highland soldier who, down to the smallest detail, so Westmacott includes on the detail the 42, which is he's a member of the 42nd Highlanders who rescued Abercrombie in battle just before he died. So it's a real, I think, powerhouse, and it is also, people didn't like it at the time, which is why I feel a bit sorry for it. People made fun of Westmacott's depiction of the horse. They said it was inelegant, so I feel a bit defensive.
So that easily comes in at number 2 for me. But
Oh,
oh yes, but I'll leave people on tenterhooks about my favorite. It's very obvious once you hear my reasoning. Luke, what's yours?
Wellington sarcophagus. It is different. It is, first of all, I mean, both Nelson's and Wellington sarcophagus have the advantage that they have no problematic imperial imagery on them because they are just giant blocks of stone. I love the stories behind Wellington's. I love that it's Cornish porphyry and Peterhead granite. It's not, despite the fact that by that point there was peace in Italy, it is not Carrara marble. But also, I just truly adore how Nelson's and Wellington's have become the center of St. Paul's entertainment trade. If you go on the St. Paul's website and look at the Nelson Chamber, and I quote, "The rotunda space is centered around the tomb of Admiral Lord Nelson, the focal point of the chamber. It is an elegant space for entertaining."
It's
I
what he would have
100%.
wanted.
It is, in fact, what he would have wanted.
So you and I could have a very protracted argument about the Wellington sarcophagus because of the many, many graves. It's one of my least favorite from the Napoleonic Wars that I've ever seen. And I maintain that Nelson wore it better. Go on, Gemma.
This was why I was giggling because I heard Luke say that and then I looked at your face and just the frown, the rage.
We will save that one for a State of the Union episode, I suspect, because Liam is very much your ally on this.
Honestly, I think we need another level of this. I think we need to just start filming our pub chats.
Yes. Is that not a standard State of the Union episode anyway?
Yes, but actually like in a pub with, it would be so much fun to just film it that way. And We could find a banquet somewhere in London and invite other historians down. Gemma, you could come down for a pub chat.
Buzzing. We could host it in the Nelson Rotunda.
There you go.
A great
Genius.
space. Yeah.
Absolutely genius. That is absolutely what both Nelson and Wellington would have wanted, is like modern day historians debating everything to do with them right besides their graves. Just very quickly, my favorite, it will surprise absolutely nobody. It's the one to More. Not that I think More necessarily was deserving of a memorial, because he screwed it up and he's saved by his death, as I've said many times before. He was facing a court of inquiry. Like, he had problems in his future if he survived. But it's the emotiveness, and it's the imagery, and it's the very it's the way in which the monument forces you to confront not so much the heroic death, but just the death itself. And for me, actually getting people to pause and reflect on the sacrifice is something that I'm always going to be behind. There you go, folks. I'm predictable. Big shock there.
More was actually going to be my second favorite, so we've kind of flipped each other.
Okay. So we're of a similar mind. Gemma, it's such a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on. When the book comes out, when the article comes out, please come back. We need to discuss this in much more detail. It's been absolutely fantastic. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording, in late July 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gombau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, Simon Weathers, and John C. The Admirals: Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Josh Mern, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, and Rob Painter. The Chiefs of Staff: David Maxwell and Adam Coslin. The Marshals: Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, and Brian Sillicutt. The Legion de Scholars: Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and of course Louis, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.